Good afternoon, students. This is Friday, 12 February 2021. Today's lecture will be the second of this week. We have one more lecture before the exam. I should point out that I posted sample examination questions yesterday, as promised. I hope you've had a chance to look at them. Remember that some of these questions may appear in the exam, maybe many of them, maybe even all of them. So it's in your interest to memorize the answers. If you answer a question and you look at the answer and you got it wrong, go back to the book, go back to the lecture in which I discussed it, go back and look at your notes, any handouts that are pertinent. If you can't figure out why the answer is as I stated it, send me an email and I'll explain it to you. Okay, so the sample questions are posted and the exam is on Thursday next week, the 18th of February, which is only 6 days from now. The exam will be open and available to you between 8 in the morning and 8 in the evening. So you have a 12-hour block. Those of you who are working, let's say from 9 to 5, you'll have to take it in the evening. So that's why I give you a 12-hour window. When you go in to take the exam, you will have only 75 minutes to complete it. So that should be enough time for you to finish, but it's not all the time you might desire. So take advantage of the 75 minutes to answer all the questions. The exam will consist of 10 true-false questions and 30 multiple-choice questions. The true-false questions are 1 point apiece for a total of 10 points. And the multiple choice questions are 3 points apiece. So 3 times 30 is 90, added to 10 equals 100. So the exam as a whole will be worth 100 points. After you complete the exam, you should be able to see your score. Now, I haven't taken an exam in Canvas. I've written exams and I see the results, but I have not actually gone in and taken one, so I don't know how it works, but I assume you can see your score as soon as you finish. Now, once I get all the exams, I will compile some statistics and I will go over them with you in the first lecture after the exam. Okay, so what lies ahead of us? Today we're going to discuss the second of 3 objections that Mill raises to his own theory. And next week, either Monday or Tuesday, I will discuss the third and final objection. The objection that we're doing today is called the too high for humanity objection. The objection that we'll discuss next week is called the lack of time objection. A couple of days ago, in my video, we discussed the first objection, which is called the doctrine of swine objection. So today's lecture should be a little bit shorter for the simple reason that I don't have to explain the form of a modus tollens argument. By now you know what it means to grab the bull by the horn or bite the bullet. So I assume you're familiar with those terms and know what they mean. We'll be using them throughout the course. Whenever we see an argument that's in the modus tollens form, we can ask whether the best strategy is to grab the bull by the horn or to bite the bullet. And you can't do both, by the way. I don't need to explain why, but it's impossible for both premises of a modus tollens argument to be false. It's impossible. So anybody who claimed that both premises are false would be claiming something that's impossible, which is, of course, irrational. So let me put it again. You can either grab the bull by the horn, which means denying the first premise, or you can bite the bullet, which means denying the second premise. If you don't reject at least one of the premises, then you're committed to accepting the conclusion. And that's not going to be a pleasant thing to do, because if the modus tollens argument is a criticism of your theory, then the conclusion of that argument is that your theory is false. And if you're the theorist, you will not be happy with that. So the theorist will always have to grab the bull by the horn or bite the bullet. for any of these modus tollens critical arguments. All right, so let's get started. Today's topic is the too high for humanity objection. I'm going to begin by quoting Mill. Then I'm going to quote Feldman, who discusses what Mill says. Then we're going to look at the argument, the modus tollens argument, and eventually we're going to ask what is Mill's response to it. Does he grab the bull by the horn, or does he bite the bullet? So here's what Mill says in his little book, Utilitarianism, back in 1863. Mill wrote the following: "The objectors to utilitarianism find fault with its standard as being too high for humanity. They say it is exacting too much to require that people shall always act from the inducement of promoting the general interests of society," unquote. So let's pause right there before we get to Feldman and discuss it. Mill thinks that many critics of utilitarianism misunderstand it. The critics think that when people act, they must always act from a certain motive. It's not enough just to do a certain thing or produce a certain result. The critics think that the theory requires that people act from a certain motive. And what motive would that be? Obviously, if we're talking about utilitarianism, the motive would be, as Mill puts it, promoting the general interests of society. Because that, after all, is what utilitarianism requires, isn't it? We saw when we discussed Bentham's felicific calculus that Bentham requires that when we act, we act in such a way as to produce the greatest balance of pleasure over pain. We have to maximize net pleasure, or net utility, as we might call it. So the theory does require that we maximize net utility, but does it require that we have that as our motive? And Mill is going to say, no, it does not. So let's look at what Feldman says. Feldman is going to put a gloss on what Mill says. And it'll be similar, but not identical. Feldman says on page 36, "These objectors, or critics, seem to be claiming that utilitarianism requires that we always act from a certain kind of motive, namely a desire to, quote, promote the general interests of society," unquote. So if that helps, Feldman is giving a gloss or an interpretation of what Mill said. Let's now look at the argument itself. It's called the too high for humanity objection. Why is it called that? Because you saw that Mill used those very words, too high for humanity. Here is the first premise. And by the way, this is a modus tollens argument form. So let's review. The first premise of a modus tollens argument is an if-then sentence. It says, if P, then Q, where P and Q stand for propositions. The second premise of a modus tollens argument denies the Q, which is called the consequent of the first premise. So the second premise says not Q, or Q is false, or it is false that Q. There are different ways to deny a proposition. The conclusion of a modus tollens argument denies the antecedent of the first premise, which is the if part. In this case, since we let P be the antecedent, the conclusion is not P. So to put it all together, and again, this is just a review. The first premise of a modus tollens argument says, if P, then Q. The second premise says, not Q. The conclusion is not P. You just have to get that form imprinted in your brain. You're going to see it over and over again throughout this book. Whenever we discuss a theory, we will examine criticisms of that theory. And most of the criticisms have the form of a modus tollens argument. Remember, modus tollens is a valid argument form. What does that mean? Again, I'll review it with you. To say that an argument or argument form is valid is to say that the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. Now, that doesn't mean that the premises are actually true. What it means is that if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true as well. Another way to put it, and there are a lot of ways to describe validity, another way is to say that the premises together entail the conclusion. E-N-T-A-I-L, entail. Another way to put it is that in a valid argument, it's impossible for the premises to be true while the conclusion is false. So obviously, if you're making an argument, you want it to be valid. And also, you want to make sure your premises are true, because if the argument is valid, and if its premises are in fact true, the conclusion must be true. What do we call it when an argument is valid and has all true premises? We call it a sound argument. A sound argument. So if you want to make a sound argument, then you need to make sure it's valid. Make sure it has a form like modus tollens or modus ponens. And you want to make sure that all of your premises are true. If you're criticizing an argument, you can try to show that it's invalid, which will not work in the case of a modus tollens argument because it's clearly valid. Or if you're trying to criticize an argument, you can show that one or more of its premises is false. Okay? So, with all that said, as review, here is the too high for humanity objection. What we're going to do now is put some flesh on the bones. So we're going to flesh out the skeleton of modus tollens. Here we go. If, and I'm quoting simply from Feldman, page 36. If U sub 7, which is, remember, this is our final formulation of act utilitarianism. If U sub 7 is true, comma, then an act is morally right only if it is motivated by a desire to promote the general interests of society. So think about that. What that says is that according to act utilitarianism, U sub 7, an act is right only if it satisfies a certain requirement. And what is that requirement? Only if it's motivated in a certain way. What way? Only if it's motivated, as Feldman puts it, by a desire to promote the general interests of society. Okay, that seems plausible, right? I mean, the theory tells us that in order to do the right thing, we have to promote the general interests of society. In other words, we have to maximize utility. So it's plausible to think that the theory requires that we always be motivated in that way. Okay, the second premise denies the consequent of the first premise, which is the statement that an act is morally right only if blah, blah, blah. I won't repeat the rest of it here. So let's read the second premise together. It says, some acts are morally right even though they're not motivated by a desire to promote the general interests of society. For example, giving correct change. When people who are in business give their customers the correct change, they're probably not thinking at all of promoting the general interests of society. How about helping a stranger? If you help a stranger who's in need, you may do so without ever giving any thought to net overall utility or doing the best for humanity as a whole, or anything exalted like that. Other examples, telling the truth, providing for one's child, respecting one's neighbors, donating to charity, keeping a promise, being faithful to one's spouse, and many other actions. Right? These are actions that are morally right, even though they are not motivated by a desire to produce the greatest good. Even though they're not motivated by a desire to produce the greatest, to maximize the greatest good, or to promote the general interest of society. The conclusion of this argument, of course, is that U sub 7 is not true. That's what follows from these two premises. So that's the argument. Obviously, Mill and Bentham will not be happy with the conclusion of this argument. Why? Because it asserts flat out that their theory is not true. And they both, of course, think it is true. So Mill and Bentham are smart men. In fact, in my judgment, having read both of them and read about them, Mill and Bentham were both geniuses. And I don't say that lightly. I mean, not every professor is a genius by any means. I won't name any names, but I've been in academia for a long time, and I can assert with the greatest confidence that many people I meet who are professors are far from geniuses. Most of them are smart, some of them are clever, all of them are smart enough to get the degree that was essential to them getting their job. But true geniuses are rare beings. And so when I say that Mill and Bentham were both geniuses, that is saying something. Both of them were child prodigies. I've told you about Mill. I haven't told you as much about Bentham, but Bentham was educated by his father. And I believe in one biography I read of Bentham, I think I recall that he went to Oxford University at the age of 12 or 13, and he was the smallest child there. So he was obviously very far ahead of his peers, kids his age. So Bentham and Mill are very smart men. Both of them, confronted with this argument, would realize instantly that it's a valid argument. They both reject the conclusion, which says that their theory is not true. So what do they have to do? They have to, in order to be consistent, they have to reject at least one of the premises. In fact, they have to reject exactly one of the two premises, because remember what I said earlier, nobody who's rational can reject both premises of a modus tollens argument. Why? Because they can't both be false. They can both be true. The first premise can be true and the second one false, or the second premise can be true and the first one false. But they can't both be false. So the question arises, what is Mill's reply to this objection? Let's leave Bentham out of it. We saw in the case of the doctrine of swine objection that Mill and Bentham had different strategies. Mill grabbed the bull by the horn in rejecting the first premise. Bentham bit the bullet in rejecting the second premise. So Bentham and Mill diverged in their reply to the doctrine of swine objection. But in this case, in the case of the too high for humanity objection, I believe Mill and Bentham would agree. They both would grab the bull by the horn. Okay, neither one of them would bite the bullet. So what does that mean in this context? It means rejecting the first premise. So let's go back and look at that first premise. The first premise says that according to act utilitarianism, you act rightly only if you're motivated in a certain way, namely to promote the general interests of society. And Mill's response to that is, no, that's not true. My theory, utilitarianism, does not require that you be motivated in that way. In fact, Mill goes further. Mill says that his theory doesn't require any particular motivation. Any motivation. The theory does not link rightness to motivation. The rightness of an act, according to Mill, has to do only with its consequences. And that's it. Nothing else matters. So remember I discussed earlier, think of a little diagram of an action. Actions are performed by agents. I'll use this hand. It's kind of confusing because it's flipped around on screen. So I'll start over here. This is the agent, the person, which means the person performing the act. The agent has a certain motive, doing good or doing ill. The motive is what causes the action. Okay, so agent has motive. Motive produces the act, and the act has consequences. According to Mill and Bentham, the only thing that matters in determining the rightness of the act is its consequences. And those, of course, come after the act is performed. Right? The consequences don't come before the act, and they certainly don't occur at the same time as the act. So once you do something, the consequences start to unfold. which means in the future. Now, the motive is in the past. The motive comes before the act. And Mill and Bentham are saying, let's just focus on Mill and leave Bentham out of it, because we have Mill's actual words to discuss. Mill says the motive is irrelevant to the rightness of the act. Only the consequences matter to the rightness of the act. Okay, so let's quote Mill. Mill says, and this is from page 23 of Utilitarianism. Actually, it's pointless of me to give you the page number because Mill's little book has been published many times by many different publishers and in many different editions. And so what's page 23 in one edition might be page 20 or 22 in another edition. So let me just put it this way. This is in chapter 2 of Mill's book. Here's what he says. This objection is to mistake the very meaning of a standard of morals and confound the rule of action with the motive of it. It is the business of ethics to tell us what our duties are. What are our duties, or by what test we may know them. But no system, here's the key part, no system of ethics requires that the sole motive of all we do shall be a feeling of duty. On the contrary, 99 hundredths of all our actions are done from other motives, and rightly so done if the rule of duty does not condemn them. So, Mill is replying to the too high for humanity objection by saying that the motive is irrelevant to rightness. He says 99% of what we do is done from other motives than this promoting the greatest interest of society. And the examples I gave you earlier show you that. What if you give correct change to your customer? Your motive in doing so probably has nothing whatsoever to do with maximizing net utility. Your motive is to keep your customer happy or simply to do the right thing. Probably the last thing on your mind when you hand the correct change to the customer is, this will maximize overall happiness for humanity. Okay? So you can act rightly without having any particular motive, much less that specific motive of producing the greatest net happiness or net pleasure. And that's what Mill is saying there. 99% of all our actions are done from other motives. And as long as they actually do maximize net happiness, net overall happiness, they're right. They still have to satisfy the test in order to be right, but they don't require any particular motive. Here's how Feldman discusses what Mill just wrote, or what I just read to you from Mill. On page 37, Feldman writes, Mill's point seems to be straightforward and simple. There's a difference between requiring, on the one hand, that our actions be in accord with or consistent with a certain rule of action, like U sub 7, and requiring, on the other hand, that our actions be motivated by a desire to be in accord with that principle. So, the way to think of it is this. If you want to do the right thing, you've got to satisfy the theory, U sub 7. You've got to actually maximize net pleasure to produce the greatest amount of net pleasure. But you don't have to have any particular motive in mind when you act. Right? That's irrelevant to the rightness of the act. Now, it is relevant to certain things. Mill points out in the same part of his book that we do care about motives. We do, and we should. But the motive of the act has no bearing on the rightness of the act. The motive of the act bears on the goodness of the agent. So, good people are well motivated. Good people tend to be motivated by the interests of everyone impartially considered. Right? Those are good people. Bad people tend to be motivated in other ways. Bad people are motivated by ill will. For example, bad people sometimes wish other people ill. Right? That's called malevolence. Malevolence is ill wishing or ill willing. Benevolence is good wishing or good willing. So a benevolent person is a person who wishes good for others. A malevolent person is a person who wishes ill or bad of others. And don't we use those motives to judge people? Benevolent people are good people. Malevolent people are bad people. So the motives matter, Mill says. We shouldn't write them off and ignore them. We should care very much about the motive, but the motive reflects on the agent. It has nothing to do with the act, with the rightness of the act. So Mill wants us to make separate judgments, doesn't he? He wants us to judge the act and the agent separately. And they can come apart. Our judgments can come apart. We might, in a particular case, say that an agent did the right thing morally, but did it from a bad motive and therefore was a bad person, or to that extent is a bad person. So, bad people can act rightly. According to Mill, that's quite possible. Let me say it again. Bad people can do the right thing. Good people, as you could probably guess, can do the wrong thing. Okay? Once Mill separates the act, the rightness of the act, from the goodness of the motive, we can make separate judgments. So let's look at a couple of examples that Feldman gives. I'm going to turn to page 37. I'm going to read a little bit. This is an interesting example of a bad person who did the right thing. Okay, so let's go over this together. Page 37, near the middle of the page. I assume you printed out the chapters and you have them there in front of you and you can follow along as I read it. If not, you can pause the video and go get your book or your printout. Okay, here we go. First example of two. Suppose an assassin is trying to murder a beloved religious leader. Okay, that's the basic situation. You've got an assassin trying to murder not just anybody, but someone who's much beloved, a religious leader. The shot misses. So maybe the assassin is a bad shot. Or maybe the religious leader moved at the last second. At any rate, the shot misses. What happens to the bullet? It hits a rock and out flows some oil. All right? Those watching check more closely and they discover a previously unknown oil reserve containing enough oil to make them all rich and happy. Everyone then shares in the wealth and lives happily ever after. So let's stop there and we'll come back in a moment. What we have is an act performed by the assassin. The act had certain consequences. And Feldman is saying that the consequences produced more net happiness than any other act that the agent, the assassin, could have done instead. Therefore, according to U sub 7, the assassin acted rightly, did the right thing. Now let's continue reading. In this case, the act had a terrible motive, right? This was a malevolent act. It was motivated by evil. Okay, in this case, the act had a terrible motive, but it nevertheless produced a tremendous amount of utility, far more than would have been produced by anything else the assassin could have done instead. According to U7, what he did was morally right. Okay, so that's Feldman's first example. What does it illustrate? We can call it the assassin case. It illustrates the possibility that, or the fact, that an act can be right even though its motive is heinous or evil or malevolent. And because the motive was bad, we can blame the agent. So what we should say to the assassin is, you're an evil person. What makes you evil is the badness of your motive. You tried to and wanted to kill a beloved religious leader. Shame on you. But I have to admit, however grudgingly, that you did the right thing, because I'm a proponent of U sub 7. I'm an act utilitarian, and rightness, according to my theory, rightness is equivalent to maximizing net happiness, and your act did that. It's only an accident, however, that your act was right. Your motive was evil, and ordinarily people with evil motives do not maximize net happiness. But through this quirky act with its consequences, you in fact did maximize net utility. So you did the right thing, but your motive was terrible, and you're an evil person for having such a motive. Okay, now the other example is really the flip side of that one. This was a case where you did the right thing, but your motive was bad. And now we need an example where your motive is good, but your act is wrong. Remember, wrong means not right. So look at page 37, just down below. Here's Feldman's second example. He says, suppose a doctor goes to the jungle to heal the villagers. Unknowingly, she carries some disease to them. As a result of her visit, the villagers catch the disease and suffer. So before I continue, size up the situation. We've got a well-meaning, well-intentioned, benevolent doctor. She's setting aside her own medical practice in the States, for example, the United States, and at some cost to herself, she's going to this other country, and at some risk to herself, she's going to this other country to minister to their needs using her medical knowledge and skill. So we should applaud that. Good for you, right? We would say, good for you. You are praiseworthy. You're well-intentioned. What a good person you are. But notice what actually happened. The villagers caught the disease that she unwittingly brought to them and suffered. In this case, Feldman says, the doctor's motive may have been excellent. In fact, praiseworthy, as we saw. But U sub 7 says she did the wrong thing. She should have stayed home. In other words, as things turned out, it would have been better had she stayed home. The villagers wouldn't have contracted this disease, we can assume, and would not therefore have suffered as a result of it. So here we have a case where a well-meaning, well-motivated person ended up doing the wrong thing. Okay? Her act actually had less than the best overall consequences. That makes it wrong. But in spite of that, she had a good motive, which redounds to her credit. It makes her a good person to that extent. Okay, so those two cases are described by Feldman to show what he considers odd features of Mill's reply to this objection. But Mill would not consider them odd features at all, because he goes on to say the following in his little book. Listen carefully now. Mill says, utilitarian moralists have gone beyond almost all others in affirming that the motive has nothing to do with the morality of the action, though much with the worth of the agent. Okay, he put it in a slightly different way. When he says the motive has nothing to do with the morality of the action, he means with the rightness or wrongness. The motive is irrelevant. It has no bearing whatsoever on the rightness or wrongness of the act. I've said that a lot. I know I'm boring you with it because I keep repeating it, but that's the key point that you need to take away from this. The motive is irrelevant to the rightness or wrongness of the act. But Mill immediately points out that the motive has much to do with the worth of the agent. And by worth, we can plug in goodness. Okay? Agents who are well-motivated are to that extent good people. Agents who are ill-motivated are to that extent bad people. Now, all of us are mixed, of course, in the sense that we sometimes are motivated well and sometimes not so well. Ideally, our motives would always be pure and we would always be motivated in the right way. But human beings, of course, are fallible and fallen, and often find themselves motivated by greed or selfishness, or even worse, motivated by a desire to harm others or to make things worse for others. Okay, so that's Mill's, that's the objection, and that's Mill's response. In the next few minutes, and we'll be done shortly, I want to talk a little bit more about praise and blame, about praising people and blaming people. Think of praise as a form of reward. When people are well motivated, we want to reward them. And one way we reward people is by praising them. You can also reward people in other ways by giving them money and so on. So praise is a form of reward. And blame is a type of punishment. When you blame people or hold them accountable for their actions, you are punishing them. Maybe not formal legal punishment, but it's an informal type of punishment. So let me discuss each of these in a little bit more detail before we part for the day. I want to talk first about praise and then blame. Praise and reward are forms of encouragement. When you praise someone, like when you say, good job, good work, you are trying to encourage not only that same person to do it again and again, but other people who may be observing what's happening. So praise and reward are actions we take that are designed to encourage more actions of that type. We praise people when they're benevolent. Why? Because more often than not, benevolent people act beneficently, which means they do good. Benevolence is a motive. Beneficence is a type of act. So let me put it a different way. People who are motivated by benevolence tend to do good. Right? Not always, because we saw in the case of the doctor that she was well motivated, but through a quirk of fate, she ended up not doing good for the villagers she was trying to help. So all we can say is, for the most part, people who are benevolent do act beneficently. They do end up doing good. All right, I think I'm going to put up a handout for you on beneficence and benevolence, and also malevolence and maleficence. So we have four concepts, and they're related in interesting ways. I have some diagrams on my handout, so I'll try to remember as soon as this lecture's over to go down to my computer downstairs and post that handout for you. All right, so let me come back to praise. We praise people when they're benevolent, since more often than not, benevolent people act beneficently. And of course, we want to encourage the doing of good. Right? We want to encourage people to do good. So we praise people who are motivated by the doing of good with the thought that they're more likely than not going to actually do good. And we're trying to encourage that. Since the doctor, in Feldman's example, since the doctor was benevolent, we praise her. Why? Because we want to encourage her to do good in the future, and we want to encourage other people, observers, to do good as well. So praising is a way of motivating people to do good. And of course, we want that. The more good doers we have, the better. Notice I said good doers. I didn't say do-gooders. You may be wondering what's the difference between a good doer and a do-gooder. There's a big difference. A do-gooder, believe it or not, is someone who's trying to do good but mucks it up and often either makes no difference at all or even makes it worse. So don't be a do-gooder. Right? Do-gooders are people who get involved in other people's affairs and make them worse, typically make them worse. So we want to encourage good doing, but not do-gooding. Does that make sense now? Look it up in a dictionary, do-gooder. And I'm not making this up. A do-gooder is actually a person we would rather not be. We should discourage people from being do-gooders. They're going around getting involved in other people's affairs and often without complete knowledge of those other people, and they end up as a result making things worse. All right, I want to talk now about blame or punishment. Blame and punishments are forms of discouragement. When you blame people or punish them, you're trying to discourage certain types of behavior. We blame people when they're malevolent. Remember, malevolence is a motive. It means motivated to do ill or bad or evil. We blame people when they're malevolent, since more often than not, malevolent people act maleficently, which means they do evil, they do bad, they do ill. Let me repeat that. We blame malevolence or malevolent people because more often than not, people who are motivated by malevolence end up doing evil, which is what maleficence is. Since the assassin was malevolent, remember, the assassin was motivated by evil. He was trying to kill a beloved religious leader. Since the assassin was malevolent, we blame him, even though through a quirk of fate, he ended up doing the right thing. So it's a little more complicated than people might think, right? We don't just say, which this would be quite mindless, wouldn't it? If we said, you did the right thing, therefore you had a good motive, and therefore you're a good person. We don't say that, because it's possible for you to do the right thing even though you were trying to do something bad. And you could be a bad person who accidentally did the right thing. You could also be a good person who accidentally did the wrong thing, like the doctor. So if I've taught you anything today, and if Mill has taught us anything, it's that we need to make separate judgments about acts, motives, and people. All of them can be evaluated in different ways, and we shouldn't just lump them all together as though we have to make the same moral judgment about all of them. Right? They come apart. The act, the motive, the agent, and the consequences all should be evaluated separately by different standards. We evaluate acts, according to Mill, we evaluate acts in terms of their consequences. We evaluate consequences in terms of whether they maximize overall happiness or not. We evaluate motives by their tendencies, right? Benevolence is a good motive because it tends to produce good. Malevolence is a bad motive because it tends to produce bad. And we also evaluate agents in terms of their motivation, right? Good people are motivated well. Bad people are motivated ill or badly. Okay, so that's the lesson. Don't mush everything together. Keep things analytically separate, right? We make and we should make separate judgments of agents, motives, acts, and consequences. Right? And you get some odd results like the assassin and the doctor, and that's fine. Right? Mill can live with that. He would say that's not odd at all. It may be unusual for a good person to end up doing the wrong thing, or a bad person to end up doing the right thing, but it's not impossible. It can happen. Sometimes it does happen. Okay, it took about as long as I thought. We're approaching 45 minutes. I wanted to discuss one objection each day so that I didn't confuse you. We've now covered two objections, doctrine of swine and too high for humanity. And we have one more to go before the exam. That'll be, I think on Monday I'd like to do your lecture, but it's possible it'll end up being Tuesday. And that's the only lecture next week because we have an exam next week. One more thing I'd like to say. Although it's slipping away from me, I knew that would happen. I should have brought it up as it came to me. Sometimes you keep talking, and I'm sure this happens to you. as well. Okay, so that's enough for today. Oh, I thought I had it back. I guess not. That's enough for today. If it comes to me and I think it's important, I'll mention it in my next lecture next week. So have a great day. Have a nice weekend. And I'll see you back on the video screen either Monday or Tuesday. And remember, I always send an email when the video is posted and ready to view. All right, see you next week.